News, one of the directors of the bank says government officials had known about its poor finances for some time. He also says officials received commission for finding the bank clients. Sonia Rusler reports from the Isle of Man on a scandal that has left a divided community.
The steam train is one of the traditions that still attracts tourists to the Isle of Man. This is a small community, proud of its ways and its independence. But the picture postcard image is deceptive. It's grown into a tax haven rivaling the Channel Islands. £6 billion are invested in bank deposits alone. And in the last month, the truth about the island's worst financial scandal has begun to unravel. The Savings and Investment Bank, or SIB, collapsed 8 years ago. £42 million went missing. More than 3,000 people, many of them locals, have never got their money back. Ken Potts lost the most, nearly £500,000.
We lived on £38 a week when the bank went bust. And I attribute that definitely to the Treasury being lackadaisical and not administering the 1975 Banking Act.
The trial last month heard the bank had lent far more than the Banking Act allowed in unsecured loans to men who are now allegedly living it up in the Costa del Sol. The trial collapsed immediately. All 8 SIB defendants were acquitted. The judge said too much time had passed, 8 full years, to make a fair trial possible. The fraud squad hadn't been called in for 5 years. In his summing up, the judge hinted at a cover-up. He said it's impossible to discover what political motive lay behind the government's action, and added, not only was there an obvious delay, but it couldn't by any stretch of the imagination be justifiable. Watching over the former SIB building, the man brought in to make sure it never happens again says the bank shouldn't have been allowed in.
If you allow people in and then seek to try and regulate them, then you are in a much more difficult situation than if you never let them in the first place.
For the first time since SIB collapsed, the bank's general manager, John Cunningham, spoke exclusively to Channel 4 News and confirmed government officials knew about the state of the bank's finances long before it crashed and failed to do anything about it. He says their attitude was cavalier.
In December 1981, through his advocate, a customer of the bank, had sent a dossier to the Treasury of about 500 pages in length, which made certain allegations of impropriety against the staff of the bank, the management of the bank, and various other parties.
That's been backed up by a Bank of England investigation. It accuses the Treasury of sloppy administration, saying they didn't object when rules were clearly being broken. The report was ready a few months after the bank collapsed, yet kept secret until last week. One reason for the delay, says John Cunningham, is that a Treasury official received commissions from the bank.
He also, with regards to other depositors, had an arrangement whereby he could earn commission on deposits which were placed with the bank, which was not unusual for the bank to give commission to people introducing deposits. It was quite normal at the time.
So, what did you actually think of that relationship yourself? What was your attitude towards it?
Well, it was something that was in existence before I joined the bank. I did think it was rather strange, and if you put it into the same context in England, it would be like John Major's assistant bringing business to a bank and expecting to earn money out of it, which I would think would raise a few eyebrows in Parliament.
Tomorrow, the government's due to announce whether or not it'll compensate the depositors. One couple, the Wilsons, who lost over £100,000, say they want justice.
The money we lost would have been worth a lot more today. If they gave it all back tomorrow, it would be nothing in comparison with what we could have
ago. But the island's Chief Minister, Miles Walker, said the scheme would be of modest proportions and insisted the government wouldn't accept legal responsibility for the crash.
For the Davis family, who lost £20,000 when the bank collapsed in the Isle of Man 8 years ago, today's announcement is their first hope of getting some money back. The bank's collapse, with losses of £42 million, was the island's worst financial scandal and damaged its reputation as an offshore financial centre. The peace of the island was recently shaken further by Bank of England accusations that the Manx government had been sloppy in supervising SIB. This weekend, the island's chief minister rejected any accusations that the previous administration had been negligent.
I would accept that it has been a painful case. I'm certainly not accepting negligence. A lot of things have happened in the Isle of Man since 1986, a lot of good things. One of the things that is hovering over us is the aftermath of the SIB.
This afternoon, the local parliament, or Tynwald, approved a public inquiry into the investigation that followed the bank's collapse. It did not mention the government's role before it happened. The unpublished inspector's report, obtained by Channel 4 News, clearly suggests there had been deficiencies. It talks of funny money deals suggested to SIB involving hundreds of millions of pounds, and of its serious concern that the official in the Treasury who was primarily responsible for the supervision of the banking sector should have been prepared to engage in transactions of this nature. The named official rejected their evidence. With the new public inquiry, the Manx people will finally learn whether or not there was a government cover-up after the bank collapsed. Those who lost their savings will now have to wait at least 2 more months to find out if
more than 3,000 creditors and losses of £42 million. It also left questions about incompetent banking supervision and allegations of corruption at the highest level. In a special report tonight, David Lomax will be piecing together what went wrong and why many victims of the affair at homes. 2 black policemen were injured in the hand grenade attacks in Pretoria. In Moscow, a group of radical Soviet MPs has said it will hold a motion of no confidence in the government of Mikhail Gorbachev, claiming his plans for the economy have no concept of a market. And here at home, England's football manager Bobby Robson has said he will resign after next month's World Cup. He is to join the Dutch club PSV Eindhoven. Markets now, and in London, the 100 index closed at 22.77. That's a fall of 10 points. In New York, the Dow Jones closed nearly 3/4 of a point down at 2855.6. The pound has closed tonight at $1.68.9, down over half a cent. This week, there's been yet another twist in the tangled financial affairs of that famous offshore tax haven, the Isle of Man. The High Court on the island ruled that for legal reasons, it still couldn't publish a secret report into the collapse of a Manx bank in 1982. David Lomax has been to the Isle of Man and finds that 8 years on, the banking scandal continues to raise questions about its booming financial sector.
In the middle of the Irish Sea, halfway between Liverpool and Belfast, is the Crown dependency of the Isle of Man. For more than 1,000 years, it's been separate from the United Kingdom. In everything except defence and foreign affairs, it's self-governing with its own parliament and its own laws. The tourist image its government promotes is of a community caught in the certainties of the past. Abortion and homosexuality are illegal here, and hanging and birching, although not now applied, are still on the statute book. These days, tourism has slumped, and the Isle of Man has had to adapt to a different way of making money. In the early 80s, one of the symbols of a new prosperity was the Savings and Investment Bank. In 1982, Percy and Mary Wilson decided to put their savings into the SIB. They'd made £104,000 from selling the hotel they ran in the capital Douglas and put the money on deposit while they found another business. A few weeks later, the bank got into difficulties and they lost every penny. They've never been compensated and claim that the Manx government is responsible.
Well, I'm bitter. I'll always be bitter about it. I mean, even if I get our money back tomorrow, I would still feel bitter. They've been determined, for some reason, right from the beginning, that we would not get any money at all. They've been determined, quite determined.
The collapse of the Savings and Investment Bank left 3,000 creditors and losses of about £42 million. But in its wake, it also left questions about inefficiencies, delay, compensation, and even of corruption. Today, 8 years later, these questions are still unresolved, and the SIB scandal, in spite of the efforts of the Isle of Man government, continues to haunt this offshore tax haven. Frances Harper is one of hundreds of local depositors who lost their savings in the SIB crash. She put her money into the SIB not because the rates were particularly high, but because it was a local bank licensed and supervised by the Isle of Man government.
It was advertised widely as a wholly independent Manx bank. The licence was in show inside, and I didn't think you could lose your money in a bank. I thought a bank was a safe place to put your money.
How much money did you put in the bank?
20,000.
In the years after the SIB collapsed, it gradually emerged that the bank wasn't Manx at all. Its ownership had been hidden at the insistence of the Isle of Man government by a number of Manx trusts. In fact, it had been bought in 1980 by this man, Victor Gray, a garage entrepreneur from Essex. At the time, the government knew that it had to attract other forms of income to the island to replace the continuing losses from tourism. In the early 80s, the SIB was ideally placed to take advantage of the Isle of Man's booming finance sector. With easy communications with Europe and beyond, business poured into the island. With few controls, there was now a unique climate where initiative could flourish with minimum inconvenience. Large amounts of cash caused little comment.
I've seen one man bring £50,000 over every Friday for 15 Fridays in a plastic bag. And the largest amount I've ever seen in cash in my life on a desk at one time was over 400,000.
And did you ask any questions about somebody wanting to deposit £400,000 in cash?
These people were normally introduced by reputable firms of accountants on the island, and it was their reference that was taken when opening the account.
Robin, when are we fixing up a committee meeting in the Isle of Man?
Mr. Michael Jordan probably knows more than anyone about the financial affairs of the Isle of Man. He's the head of a London team of inspectors and liquidators who spent more than 3 years investigating the affairs of the SIB. This is the 500-page report he produced for the Manx government. He couldn't let us read it because it's still not been published. Mr. Jordan discovered that special companies had been set up with nominee directors in the Channel Island of Sark. It's a technique which was known as the Sark Lark. These companies then received loans from the SIB which were never repaid. There were soon huge losses.
There was really very sloppy banking indeed. It amounted to reckless lending. Over 33 million of that, over 3/4, had been lent to 5 very curious organizations. One of them was the Silbari Group, which was very much wrapped up in these Isle of Man sarked companies. And over £8 million just disappeared into thin air through a whole section of hiatus companies, just disappeared. Nearly 5 million was lent to Gil Hunter, who I think now resides in Spain. He spent money like water, in fact, on a hotel on the front in Douglas.
This hotel, now under new ownership, somehow swallowed nearly £2 million. There were many other loans, some to people who didn't exist, others to firms who had no security and soon went bankrupt. The Manx government ought to have realised that all was not well. The evidence was in the Treasury's own in-trays from the bank's own returns. Mr. John Cunningham was manager of the SIB. He claims that for 16 months before the crash, the bank's returns showed that the SIB was insolvent.
As early as February 1981 and twice again in that year in the quarter returns, somebody in the bank had made a mistake in filling the forms in, which showed the bank to be insolvent, as I say, as early as February 1981. Yet no steps were taken by anybody at the Manx Treasury to investigate these returns.
In 1982, the government should have realised that the SIB was overstretched. But not far away, in Athol Street, the financial centre of the island, the word had somehow leaked that all was not well. Those in the know began to withdraw their money.
In one particular instance, within the United Kingdom, we believed that money was withdrawn because somebody was tipped off. And of course we did pursue that particular aspect. But of course, you know, if you have a lot of rumours, which obviously abounded in the Isle of Man at that time, there must have been a number of depositors who did take their money out just before the crash.
What's been suggested is that there's a sort of cosy old boys network, and that if you're in the know, you tip off your friends and make sure that they're not harmed.
Well, I think so to a degree.
Others who weren't in the know weren't so fortunate. They had no hint of the trouble to come.
Oh, we didn't hear it was a problem. But there was nothing. The bank had just gone one day.
The doors were shut.
The doors were shut and that was it.
You went down to the bank to try and get your money out?
Oh, yes, but it was too late. The doors were closed.
What did they say to you?
There was nobody there to say anything to you. We're closed. And a notice on the door. And that's all there was.
At the time of the SIB crash, Dr. Edgar Mann, a local GP, was head of the island's finance board. Today he runs a model shop, but then was the politician responsible for the finance sector.
I don't personally accept responsibility. Certainly, as the law stood at the time within the Banking Act in the Isle of Man, the responsible authorities for the supervision were the officials.
But didn't you know that there were millions of pounds in unsecured loans being made by that bank?
I did not. I know this sounds very strange. I certainly was well aware immediately afterwards when we started looking into it. But I did rely upon the Treasurer of the Isle of Man at the time, who was the responsible official.
That official was Mr. William Dawson, seen here at a recent business reception in Douglas. Mr. Dawson was recruited to the Isle of Man from the local council at Woking. In 1982, he was head of the Manx Treasury, and in spite of the criticisms of a Bank of England report, is still in the same job today. Mr. Dawson says that under the Manx system of self-regulation, he was satisfied when the auditors reported that the SIB accounts were in order. He told us that he didn't want to appear in this programme. He didn't want to appear before the inspectors either.
We didn't get the cooperation we felt we should have got from certain of the officials in the Manx government.
You're talking about Mr. Dawson?
In particular, yes.
How would you describe the sort of control which Mr. Dawson exercised over the bank?
Well, I've seen the report, in fact, the Bank of England report, and that refers to sloppy administration of the banking supervision. And I would go along with that in point of fact.
For many years, the Chief Constable of the Isle of Man had been asking the Manx government to pay for a fraud squad. In 1986, they agreed. After 3 reports and more than 4 years, the newly formed fraud squad on the island started to look into the SIB. With police help from the mainland, 8 men were charged with various financial irregularities. The SIB trial was held in a derelict hotel in the holiday resort of Port Erin. Lawyers were flown here from Britain and settled in for what looked like being a long and complex case. The Isle of Man government earmarked £10 million for legal expenses. At the pre-trial hearing here at Port Erin, a story of the Manx government's sloppy banking supervision, of administrative incompetence and inefficiency, and of what the judge called indefensible delay was gradually unfolded. The defence lawyers even alleged that there had been corruption among civil servants at the highest level. It was said in court that the number 2 at the Manx Treasury, the island's commercial relations officer, had steered business to the SIB. According to bank memos read out in open court, one of these proposed deals was for $500 million, and the commission which the civil servant would have received was $4.5 million. How proper would it be for a civil servant in the Manx government to accept commissions for introducing business to a bank like that?
Well, I think one must draw one's own conclusions to that question. I certainly would.
Which are?
I really can't comment on that because it is outlined in our report.
The civil servant, Mr. Peter Duncan, now lives modestly outside Douglas and works as a financial consultant. He resigned from the Manx Treasury at the time of the SIB crash. At first, he agreed to be interviewed so that he could reject the allegations made in court. He said he'd never profited from the deals he'd arranged and had never received the memos about commissions. Later, he changed his mind about an interview. Last month, the court case in Port Erin was abandoned. The judge decided that after all the delays, a fair trial would be impossible. Some key witnesses had died, and the principal defendant, Mr. Victor Gray, was ruled unfit to plead because of a breakdown and loss of memory. At the time of the police investigation, the Isle of Man's Minister of Finance was Mr. David Cannon. He told us his priority then had been rooting out what he called the grubby end of the market. At the end of last year, he was sacked by the Chief Minister and is now a backbencher in the island's Parliament. He's one of the few members who've had a chance to study the SIB reports.
We're going through an unfortunate period now where there is a big post-mortem as to what went on with the SIB. All is being revealed. The skeletons are coming out of the cupboard. The matter has got to be dusted down and finally buried. We have got to see where in government there was negligence, maladministration. After all, there have been allegations of deceit and lies and inefficiency, allegations made publicly in court. Our government has got to get its house in order that never again can a finger be pointed at the public service in the Isle of Man.
Last week, surrounded by all the trappings of an Isle of Man parliamentary occasion, Manx politicians met in Douglas to discuss the SIB and the delicate question of using taxpayers' money as compensation. The proceedings were observed by creditors like Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, who were hoping that there'd soon be some good news. As usual, the deliberations were supervised by the Queen's representative, a retired general.
I'm the presiding officer. But I better go and preside, I think. Come and join us.
Unfortunately, our cameras were not allowed inside until later. In the most recent debate here in Tynwald, the Isle of Man's Parliament, the Manx government has at last admitted, after 8 years, at least some responsibility for the SIB scandal. It's agreed to make modest ex gratia payments and to have another inquiry. But the affair is still far from over. No decision has yet been made about which creditors are to be paid how much or when. No decision has been made about when the inspector's report is to be published. It's to stay secret for at least several more months. And there's no decision about when its own inquiry is to be published. The Chief Minister of the Isle of Man is Mr. Miles Walker, a dairy farmer. It was he who had to persuade his cabinet colleagues that it was now time to lay the SIB affair to rest. He had to adjudicate between those who wanted to pay and have yet another inquiry, and those who argued that compensation wasn't necessary, that it would be far better to put the affair behind them. The Chief Minister had to cajole his colleagues into accepting a compromise.
What we have been talking about thus far is the principle of whether or not an ex gratia payment should be made. We're not talking about compensation. We know that the Privy Council have found that the government are not legally liable and didn't have a duty of care. We are talking about a scheme for ex gratia payments, which will particularly favour the smaller depositor.
I'm sure that Mr. Walker intends the best, but first of all, the sums involved are obviously going to be limited. In his own words, I think they're going to be fairly modest. And I think we will raise expectations of what sums are going to be available, and they're not going to satisfy. And therefore this will continue and continue.
This is Manx Radio's Man in Line with David Collister.
Proof of this came less than a day later on the government-owned Manx radio station.
And possibly the item you may wish to talk about today is the Savings and Investment Bank.
Mr. Walker's compromise doesn't seem to have satisfied anyone.
You have no idea what this has done to us. It has ruined, as far as I'm concerned, they may as well put a gun to our head because it's ruined 8 years of our lives. For God's sake, show you have a heart, Isle of Man government. Please don't be half-hearted. Pay the honest depositors in full.
Ralph is calling me right now. Hello, Ralph.
Oh, hello, David. Well, there's been an awful lot of verbal diarrhea regarding the SIB. The government, which is ultimately the taxpayer, should not pay out one iota.
You're a hard man.
I'm not a hard man. I'm just practical.
Could you have a look at that and let me have...
To guard against a repeat of the SIB affair, Mr. Jim Noakes, a former Bank of England official, was hired by the Manx government to set up a financial supervision commission. Mr. Noakes and his team have drawn up new banking regulations and claim that the whole system has now been overhauled and reformed. As far as banking is concerned, the cowboy days are over.
We all make mistakes and we have to learn from them. But I'm satisfied that the conditions which produced SIB are no longer present and therefore it will not happen again.
I think our future is assured. I think the confidence in the island is growing all the time. The island is looked on by the major institutions now as a good place to do business in, and I have every confidence in that future.
Business in the Isle of Man doesn't seem to have been inhibited by the new regulations or the SIB crash. In Douglas, new office blocks are springing up all around Athol Street. Deposits in Manx banks are continuing to multiply. Unemployment hardly exists. But in spite of this, the SIB affair has still left doubts about other possible areas of financial irregularity. For some local people, it's even raised questions about whether to have a finance sector at all. Recently, the Isle of Man has been experiencing a reawakening of interest in Manx culture. This has coincided with increasing concern over the government's handling of the SIB affair. But cultural evening classes haven't been enough to satisfy the more radical of Manx nationalists. Chris Shaird is one of them. He and two friends formed an organisation opposed to the finance sector and called it FSFO. The slogan was not so much Manx as an instruction to the finance sector in Anglo-Saxon. 2 years ago, they started fires in half-built new houses which they thought were intended for English finance sector workers. They were charged with arson and criminal damage and sentenced to 2 years in prison. But instead of burning down houses, you might have started a political party.
The finance sector is allowed to continue growing in the Isle of Man. It means the loss of the Manx culture and thereby the loss of the death of the Manx nation, the end of 1,000 years of history.
These offices were once daubed by Manx nationalists worried about a new direction in the growth of the island's finance sector. They house OCRA, a legal company formation agency. 45 people here are employed processing paperwork for more than 2,500 non-resident Manx registered companies. They don't need to know what any of the companies do. There are now more than 37 company formation agencies in the island. This one says its international clients come to the Isle of Man for its confidentiality. The registry in Douglas lists more than 30,000 Isle of Man companies. Many are non-resident doing legitimate business in other parts of the world. These companies don't have to file accounts. There's no record of the beneficial owners.
It's not unique, you know, to the Isle of Man. There are a lot of areas of the world where you can have a similar operation. And I mean, I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I personally think it's a very bad thing. I think in any set of circumstances, the beneficial owner of a company should be disclosed.
So how does it work in the Isle of Man?
Well, in the Isle of Man, it works on a basis that you cannot trace who the beneficial owners of a company are from the statutory records, nor indeed can you get behind the directors.
Bascam Investments is run from a village in northern Spain. Recently, questions were asked about it in the island's parliament. All the records show is that the last directors were 3 secretaries in another company formation agency. Among the hundreds of companies registered in this office is Van der Steen. It's based in Antwerp and has been dealing in commodity futures. Earlier this month, the banking authorities in Britain won a restitution order for £214,000 against Van der Steen. But what can you and your commission do about all the people who are putting money into these non-resident companies in the Isle of Man when you can't possibly know what that business is really doing?
Yes, you're quite right, and we are concerned about it. We have spent a lot of time thinking about the way in which we can do something to deter or to prevent this kind of thing. The problem is that you've got here abuses of fundamental principles. You've got abuses of fundamental principles like the separation of the company from the individuals. You've got fundamental abuses of the principle of limited liability. All these basic principles on which the whole of our company's law, not here but worldwide, is founded. That's what's at stake here.
What areas of abuse are you aware of?
Well, mainly it is the companies which are set up on the island and which operate elsewhere.
What sort of things have you done, and what are you planning to do?
Well, I think we have to wait until we get the legislation on the stocks, because obviously there is a certain amount of confidentiality in this one, and we don't want the horses to run really before we close that door, and we would like to be in a position really to tackle that one properly.
For those who've suffered in the SIB affair, the closing of doors now is academic. Creditors who've campaigned for compensation for 8 years are not likely to be easily satisfied, whatever the government offers.
They should pay more, not less, for our 8 years. Not less. And really, if they do pay us out, I feel it will be a very cheap way of bringing this island onto a solid base for a financial future.
When you have casualties in the financial sector, I think that you should attend to the casualties.
For the creditors, the questions which the SIB affair has raised about the continuing possibility of irregularity and abuse in the Isle of Man have still not been answered.
And David Lomax's report ends this edition of Newsnight, but a little later, at 12:10 on BBC One, I'll be back with Peter Snow and Peter Sissons to bring you a special programme covering the result of today's parliamentary by-election in Bootle on Merseyside, where the counting of the votes is now in progress. Join us then if you can. Till then, goodbye.
Change is in the air.